Gouts of blue flame burst out of the fractured hull of the Fury. The acrid scent of fuel combusting in an oxygen-rich atmosphere stung King's throat as he stumbled to his feet. Head swimming in a sharp pain in his side, he scanned the wreckage of his ship. They'd landed in a dense forest, jungle-like and thickly laden with plant life. The Fury's unsteady descent and semi-crash landing had torn a path through the undergrowth, fragmenting as it skidded to a stop in a furrow of rich earth and mulched plant matter. Now it lay in pieces, spitting up its mechanical guts in the equivalent of death throes. His eyes adjusted as his spinning vision steadied, lungs filling with the atmosphere that he hoped was palatable for him. Among the chunks of hull and intricate wiring, the occasional body slumped. King staggered forward, hoisting a piece of wreckage to the side and finding only muck and oil beneath it. Despite his injured state, movement was easy on this moon. It felt like less than half a G gravitationally. He must take advantage of that to root out his crew, if any survived. The lump that was Clayton's body stuck out of the wreckage to his left, and he rushed over, pulling some sheet metal aside. Clay looked battered and bruised, but the steady rise and fall of his chest suggested he was merely unconscious, and King dashed away to find more of the crew, knowing at least that his fellow human lived.
Did anyone else make it?
He thought, a lump in his throat. He shook his head to steady himself, then set himself to pulling apart the aft bulkhead before him. He grasped the sharp metal edges tightly and pulled with straining back muscles. Wires twisted and metal groaned, eventually giving way with a snap as a section of the bulkhead tumbled away into the undergrowth. Dappled light flooded into the section he had opened, and a dizzy-looking Alabest squinted up at him, her reptile frame coiled up in a protective position. The Hickite flicked her tongue in relief as King gently pulled her free from the ship's wreckage. She slumped down to sit on the forest floor, trying to catch her breath. "Thank you, King," she hissed weakly. He simply nodded, before moving off to search for more survivors. Several hours later, the ragged remnants of the crew were gathered, a small fire lit from what dry detritus they could gather. About half the crew was laid out for burial a small ways away from the wreckage, as the living began to prepare a solemn and meagre meal from what little rations they had managed to scrape together. King stood up, despite the overexertion and grief that tugged at him. He'd only known most of these people for a couple of months, but the bonds they'd built made their loss cut deep. He looked around the rest of them, tired and injured, as they passed out rations in near silence, and spoke out in his best attempt at Central dialect.
"Hey, we've had some good times these past weeks. Things look like they're gonna get tough now, but you're a strong crew, a hardy lot, and I know we'll pull through this."
The crew's faces looked up at him, a mixture of trust and admiration rising through the drained looks on their faces, from what he could tell despite the species difference. He felt a surge of pride and responsibility.
"Let's lay our friends to rest. Then we'll see about fixing ourselves up some pile of junk to get us off this rock. What do you say?"
The murmur of agreement that bubbled up among the worn-out crew was all he needed to hear, but it wasn't the only thing he heard. The crunch of a waterlogged stick beneath the foot of something large turned several heads to the undergrowth beyond their firelight. Like a leviathan in the deep, a bulky shape loomed out of the darkness of the jungle, the squelch of muck accompanying its footfalls. The flicker of the flames gave the occasional glimpse of matted fur and a protruding tusk, as something stalked around the outskirts of the light. The crew sat stock still, necks craning to watch the shadow of this creature as it circled. King had not seen a single living thing larger than himself or Clay since the day he'd flown through that portal. From the outline he'd seen as it passed closer, this thing was the size of a bear. A glimmer of fear rose in his mind as he turned slowly to follow the beast with his vision. Clayton rose slightly, picking up a jagged hunk of the ship's wreck, and locked his eyes on King. King held out his grubby hand to motion, "Wait." The rest of the crew shifted to prepare for action. The campsite coiled like a spring, tensed. The large creature in the shadows sensed something, and it growled a booming, guttural snort, and charged, launching itself into the light. A lumbering hunk of stinking, matted grey-green fur with 4 legs tumbled towards the crew. The beast's snout-like face snarled with large, sharp tusks jutting from its slathering jaw. The crew scattered, rolling away from the obvious trajectory of the stomping hoof-like feet below the creature. A few of the crew had equipped themselves with the last remaining arsenal of the ship. With these they let off a few blasts of plasma which singed the hide of the beast. Others lashed out with sharp struts of metal, piercing its sides. Enraged, the beast spun around the centre of the camp, its eyes maddened with pain and ornery territorial pride. Clayton seized this moment of confusion to lunge forward and stab deeply into the creature's haunches. Its howl of pain scattered into the dense forest, shaking drops of water free from the leaves of nearby trees. As it reared back, the crew peppered its light green underbelly with plasma fire, causing the howl to twist into a squeal. The next instant, a second huge shadowy shape launched itself into the air in the camp. A heavy thunk split the air, and a large squealing beast staggered as King swung his huge blade directly into the tusked skull of their adversary turned prey. A simultaneous heavy clang sounded, and the blade tore itself apart from the impact, cracked as it was from their crash landing. The fragmented blade fell alongside the limp body of the beast. As quickly as it had started, the flurry of movement settled into dead silence, before the chirps and squawks of the alien jungle began to flood back to fill the air. Clayton scattered some small stones over the fresh graves in which the gathered bodies of the crew had been laid carefully to rest. The fierce bond that builds between shipmates in times of strife and battle sealed their memories in his mind. He furrowed his thick brow, contemplating the swathe of destruction he and King had torn through the system since they smuggled themselves through the gate. The riches they had gathered in that time were scattered among the forest, like the stones he cast on his friends' graves. He turned back toward the firelight, which had a bed of coals spread out from it and a large spit constructed over them. The boar-like beast they had felled rotated slowly over the hot charcoal, wafting the delicious scent of roasted pork through the air with the occasional pop as a splash of melting fat dripped onto the glowing bed below. Striding away from his moment of contemplation, the large silent human joined the rest of the crew in their anticipation for the meal. The others looked up at him, reassured by his presence. King was a stronger fighter than Clayton, but his wild moods and savagery lent to some fear and caution from the crew. Clay's towering human bulk and quiet nature made him a foundational member of the crew, even if he didn't speak with them much. He sat on a heavy log that a couple of the others perched upon, shifting it under his weight. He caught Priato's eye. The Biberi gunner's tiny bird-like body quailed next to his own, but Clay gave him a small smile and a nod before turning back to the middle. "Shall we eat?" he murmured to the others, in some of the few words that he did speak of their language. The moments of joviality that followed were as rejuvenating as the hearty meal they filled their bellies with. The meat was light, its low density allowing for the sheer bulk of the beast on this small moon, but the volume available made up for its airy texture, and it crisped up nicely. Paired with some scraps of ship's rations, it certainly raised their spirits. The Anorans of the crew didn't typically eat meat, but the chance for hot food after the trauma of the crash was enough to stir the omnivorous side of their appetite, so every crew member ate well, but their restful feast was short-lived. Echoing pulses rang through the air, telltale signs of the shockwaves induced by atmospheric entry. 2 large Anoran craft drifted into the crew's vision to the far north, the friction-induced flaring around their bulbous hulls, casting flickering light through the boughs of the trees above. Clay's first reaction was to turn to King, his friend and guide, who looked up calmly with grim determination as the crew rushed to kick dirt over the fire. To Clay's surprise, a smile played across King's bearded features as the lights of the searching ships flickered reflections over the surface of his eyes.
"There's our ride,"
King drawled. Read by A Good Bean.